Okay, that's great, right? And first of all, namaste to everyone. I was born and brought up in Sadashivpet here in Pune. Then, like Anjali said, I joined the National Defense Academy, and the National Defense Academy took me everywhere, right? I had the privilege of visiting different countries, different serving in different parts of the country in service of our motherland. And then finally, last year, I have come back to my own city, Pune. And there are five things here that have not changed. You want me to recount those five things that have not changed? The five things that haven't changed in this is first is what hasn't changed is Chitale Bandhu. Chitale Bandhu hasn't changed. Vaishal hasn't changed. Budhani hasn't changed. Marzorin hasn't changed. And the fifth thing is the enormous academic appetite of Punekars hasn't changed. So therefore, I think it's a bit of a daunting task speaking front of such an educated audience and such a vibrant audience. So thank you, Rotary, for giving me this privilege. At this point in time, I would also like to welcome Mr. Parag Tope, who is a descendant of the Tope, Tatya, the famous Tatya Tope, without whom 1852 would not have happened. And he is the architect of Operation Red Lotus, for which I was fortunate to be a team member in the research and writing part of it. So Mr. Parag Tope will join us, especially during the answer session. So I'm going to start sharing my screen and get started straight away. Can everyone see my screen yet or no?
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Yes,
Okay.
sir, we can
Yeah.
see you.
Okay. Can everyone say Shaniwara Vada?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. Let's get going. So I'm going to talk about the naval uprising and the war independence of 1857. Right. So now I'm going to start with the overview of my presentation. What would be the kind of flow in this? Flow is, yeah, we'll just about some time on the difference between history and what is itihas. Then imagining freedom on 18 February 1946, not in 1947, not August. Right? It's 18 February 1946. What happened that time? Then the possible causes of the naval uprising. The unfinished agenda of 1857. What is the connect one sees between 1857 and 1946? We'll have a look at that. Then we look at what Mr. Parati calls as the triad of freedom. And this triad of freedom consists of the economic freedom, personal freedom that we fought for, the political freedom, and critically losing the battle and winning the war of 1857. What did we lose and what did we win in 1857? And then we'll have the question and answer session. Expect to allot maximum amount of time for the question and answer session with Mr. Parag Tope. Okay, so let's get started. So there are two words out here which interest me, history and freedom. Right? Have a look at both these words. First of all, whenever one says the word history, I feel that we are talking about something that's dead. It may not be forgotten, but that's something that's over, something happened, something that's not living. And most authors, and I'm talking about Western authors as well, foreign authors, commercial authors, etc., made lots of money on this entire concept of history. Foreign authors, there are so many foreign authors who have been telling us our own history. Most of Indian history written by foreign authors. And of course, people have made money of it. And of course, there have been appointed historians by different governments or commission people from different parts of society, right? So all these historians are also writing our history. Now, most of the foreign authors of Indian history, they romanticized colonial history. They thought that colonial history, by telling us Indians that colonial history is all about elephants, about big Maharajas, about these tiger hunts that took place. So they romanticized colonial history. What was the truth? The reality was something different. The reality was most of our martial art people were tied to cannon and blown to bits. That's how our martial arts were killed. So this is what we are talking. This is what was reality. Reality was tyrannical. Reality was shocking, right? But they thrived in romanticizing colonial history. Let's look at something else. Right. And what is this freedom? This word freedom. And I mean, is there an application form for freedom or something like that? I thought freedom was supposed to be fun. So let's put these two words behind us, history and freedom. And then let's see, what does itihas mean? I mean, in our mother tongue, what does itihas mean? Itihas simply means it happened. That's it. And if it happened, it is something which is in the living memory of each and every one of us. Thus, the Mahabharata or the Ramayana is not something that is history. It's nothing that's dead. It lives in every one of us. So the bigger question that I want to ask today, and hopefully get the answers at the end of this discussion, is to whom does history belong? Does history belong to the authors who wrote this? Does history belong to a few scholars? Does history belong to different government? Or does it really belong to you and me, the people of the country? What about them? So this is the bigger question that we should not lose focus of. And this is going to be sent to our discussion at a later stage. So I'm asking you to imagine freedom. Imagine freedom on 18th February 1946. Now, what happened on 18th February 1946 was the naval uprising. Now, in this naval uprising, what happened? On top, you see out there is HMIS Talwar, right, in Mumbai, HMIS Talwar. And the British ensign, which you see at the bottom left corner, the British ensign was brought down. And what was brought in its place was the Azad Hind flag. What was raised on the mast was the Azad Hind flag. And in addition to that, the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League flag were raised. So imagine a situation now. I'm asking you to imagine, those of you who are familiar with Mumbai, imagine the situation right from near Taj Mahal. I'm talking about South Mumbai, Colaba. So imagine Taj Mahal Hotel. There's a radio club there. Then there is the Royal Bombay Yacht Club. And there's the Lion Gate, and so on and so forth. I'm going to come back to this. So HMIS Talwar was the communication ship, and you'll be surprised to know this was the extent. All the red dots that you see on your screen today are the ones where our ships, which were stationed, our naval bases that were stationed, all took part in this uprising. Right from Aden, Gulf of Aden, can you see that dot out there, the red dot out there? This Gulf of Aden was one of our radio stations. To Gwadar, then Karachi, Mumbai, Karwar, may not be Karwar, but Kon, Visakhapatnam, Port Blair, everywhere, our ships had their guns pointed. So in total, there were 78 ships, 80,000 people who were angry in Kolkata and about 20-odd thousand in Mumbai. You're talking about Kalagoda, you're talking about Devi. Everybody was out on the roads, and each and every ship had their guns pointed at the government offices. So if you go back by and imagine in front of your eyes the old Reserve Bank of India building, which is right near Custom House, right? Some British officer quickly ran up there, and through his binoculars, he was watching what's happening on the ship, and he was shot dead. So that was the beginning of the naval uprising. So this went on for many days, and everyone joined in. Firefighters, everyone was a nation that was, and everyone joined in. So this is what I'm talking about. 78 ships, 80,000 people, etc. And the British Empire was shaken at this point in time. It was shaken, and people did not listen to anyone. The naval ratings did not listen to anyone. Finally, the British government had to request Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel to come down to Mumbai. And on 24th of February 1946, he said these famous words, "Azadi to ab chand dino ki baat hai." Let that sink in. Azadi to ab chand dino ki baat hai. And in recognition of all this, there's a very interesting thing here. Here's Times of India. Times of India thought something completely different. The Times of India thought this was thoughtless violence going on in Mumbai. the naval uprising, I thought there was thoughtless violence going on in Mumbai, right? And yeah, in memory of all this, in memory of the contribution of the Indian Navy on the naval uprising, the Ashoka Chakra in our tricolor today is navy blue in color. It's not black, it's navy blue in color. And that is what we remember from this. Okay, so why the uprising? What caused it? What are the factors? We've seen that the uprising happened. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel came to Mumbai, dealt with it. But what are the causes? What could be the possible causes of the uprising? Is what I'm going to go on for a while. Okay, now the INA, it started its march from Myanmar, right? And in 1942, and I know that Captain Mohindra, a very senior naval officer, is with us this program today. And as I was speaking with him, he said yesterday that that when Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose started from there, what he did was he sent 5 of INA officers to Bahadur Shah Zafar's grave in Rangoon, and they took the blessings of Bahadur Shah Zafar before starting march towards liberating our country. So the factor number one for the naval uprising at that time was the INA had started its march. So there was nationalistic fervor for freedom was what was going on. What was the other factor? The other factor was entirely man-made. The British policies that time in Bengal, and some historians are of the view that the British policies were designed in such a way so as to stop the march of the INA into India. They caused this Bengal famine in 1943. And do you know how many people died in the Bengal famine of 1943? The surprising figure is 40 lakh people died at that point in time. And that was enough to stop the INA probably. But the British were going exactly the way they had tried this before Ireland potato famine of 1845. In the potato famine of 1845, the British had starved the entire Irish population exactly in the same way. So they were kind of experienced in creating these man-made famines. So this was the second factor. The first factor was the INA had started. Second factor was the Bengal famine. I mean, even look at it even today. How can a country, a state that's blessed have a famine where 40 lakh people die? The third factor was in Red Fort. In Red Fort, the INA trials had started. And they were trying 3 of their senior officers, Major General Shahnawaz Khan, Colonel Gurbakht Singh Dhillon, and Major Prem Sehgal. These officers who were being tried were being sentenced, and that caused enormous anger amongst the people, and that anger spilled over to the streets. In addition to that, so many of our Indians had fought for the British in the Second World War. All around the world, the estimate is about 25 lakh Indians had fought in the Second World War. So they knew that the British were vulnerable. They knew what were the policies of the British. So the time was actually getting ripe to overthrow their rule in India, right? And people were extremely patient with the leadership. The leadership present at that point in time, people were extremely impatient with that Azadi kab milne wali hai. So all these factors, these 5 factors, were something that led to build over to the naval uprising. But the foundations of this, the foundation of the entire naval uprising lay in our quest for freedom, which started in 1857. Now, before we go out here, I would like to ask a simple question. The simple question is this. Does anyone have the answer to this? How long did the War of 1857 last? We asked ourselves this question. When we started research, we asked ourselves this question. How long did the War of 1857 last? Because what we've been taught in school is very different to what actually happened. So the war of 1857 lasted almost 2 years. And even if one were to do some simple calculations, something like this. For example, if one soldier consumes 1 kilograms of rations per day, and if 50,000 soldiers fight for 1 month, they would need 1,500 tons of food. So the big question is, who planned it? Who planned all the rations? Who funded this war, which lasted for 2 years? I mean, an army moves on its stomach. So who fed? So who planned it? Who funded it? So these are the questions that we asked ourselves. And I'm proud to present, this is the book which is written by Parag Tope. It's called Tatya Tope's Operation Lotus. It took us 4 years of research writing. And that we have detailed about more than about 55 battles have been analyzed with military style maps and troop movements. It's a military history reader's delight, I can assure that. And some hundreds of Urdu original letters were translated, and that went into the writing of this book, right? And I'm sure Mr. Parag Tope will speak later about this, right? And I was privileged to be a part of the research and part of the writing team as well, right? So, what does this book talk about, and what is the connection of 1857 with the naval uprising? Is what we will try and see in the next 10 to 15 minutes. Let's try and see. Okay. So, what we're talking about is the grandson of Bahadur Shah Zafar. The grandson of Bahadur Shah Zafar, on 25th of August 1857, at Azamgarh, he made a declaration. Now, 20th August 1857 is a few months after the war started. The war started on 10th May 1857. So large parts of India were free by then. And in Azamgarh, the declaration that he made was, what are our people suffering from? What were the problem of the people? So here's the declaration. The first thing he said is, look at this high taxation. About 50 to 6% of people's income were taxed. So high taxation, the entire trade was being monopolized by the British. It killed local trade. There was complete de-skilling of our workers, de-skilling of our weavers, de-skilling of our of luxury good makers. Remember, we were a finished luxury goods exporter. So large de-skilling happened. There was complete economic discrimination, and most importantly, the religious persecution as well. So if we just try and summarize all these points of the declaration which was made by the grandson of Shah Zafar, we arrive at what Mr. Parag Tope calls as the triad of freedom. The triad of freedom comprises three big pillars: physical freedom, economic freedom, and personal freedom. So I'm going to start first with the economic freedom, then we'll go on to the freedom, and then let's see the political freedom part of it. So the economic freedom, look at this. I would want you to spend some time looking at this graph. This is what India's share of the world GDP over the centuries. And the one in blue where this arrow starts, it was India's share. So we started at somewhere around 32%. And in 2001, we are less than 2% of the world GDP. And I would want you to compare this with the stack in purple, which talks of West Europe. So this is the kind of long-term economic devastation that the British inflicted on us. Okay. This is what I'm sharing with you on your screen now is the coat of arms, as it is called, of the East India Company. According to one economist, the British colonizers looted 45 trillion from India. And this is, I'm quoting a very recent article, 21st November 2018 in Live Mint. This is the figure that's quoted by certain economists. Over a period of time, 45 trillion. Let's just put that in perspective. If you put that in perspective, the current GDP UK is just 3 trillion. So do you see the magnitude of loot that took place? So this is what caused long-term economic damage to us. So what are the things that cause long-term economic damage to us? One of the first things that caused long-term economic damage to us was William Bentinck. William Bentinck, I think, was the Governor General in this period, was so-called land reforms. Now that land reform is a euphemism for control of land. Large chunks of land went into the hands of only a few. Some of them were zamindars, but the zamindars were ineptly controlled by the British. So what did they do there? So all the crop plantations were gone and they were replaced with poppy and opium. So I have no hesitation in saying that the East India Company was the largest drug running cartel in the world in that point in time, which I prove in a little while. So the land reforms led to food shortages, and agriculture of India was replaced by opium plantations. Let's see this. Let's see if I can support my claim by saying that the East India Company is the largest drug running cartel in the world. Look at the area under cultivation of opium in thousands of acres. On the first two figures are 2006 figures for Afghanistan and Colombia. And the last bar on the right, what was colonial India 100 years before that, in 1906. Can you see the amount of acreage which was under opium cultivation in India? And this is from some latest British Parliament figures. And the revenue in 1906 was estimated to be so many pounds from so-called opium trade. I mean, they were drug runners, the East India Company, right? So where did all this go? So there's one more estimate that we did in the book, that here's a chest of opium. A chest of opium would typically contain about 160 pounds of opium. That's that pure opium, etc. And between 1854 and 1859, there are sources which say that more than 70,000 chests per year were being manufactured in India. And one chest at that time was valued at about $2,075. Do your calculations per year, you make this much. $145 million per year. To a private limited company, remember that the East India Company was a private limited company of 100 shareholders. So can you imagine the amount of money that they made through just drug trading alone? And where did all this go? All this went to China. It was pumped into China via Hong Kong. Hong Kong was their launching pad. And look at this figure from the UN office on drugs. And between 1822 and 1880, can you see the steep rise in the graph? That was India under opium cultivation, which led to the pumping of opium into China in this period. Not just. So yeah, this will give you some kind of visual representation. The opium went from Mumbai, Calcutta, and Patna. Patna was a big manufacturing hub of opium. It went straight into China via Hong Kong, and what went out of China was tea, silk, and porcelain, and all that into Britain from there. Right. So here's one visual of the opium balls stacked in a factory in Patna. Look at the size of the people and look at the size of the factory. So can you imagine how many stories this factory could have been? This looks like a massive godown. This is where the opium was stacked. Right. And then China suddenly found that its population was being wasted. Here on the right, you see a picture of people who are completely wasted. It's a picture from that time. People are drug addicts. And the Chinese emperors fought two massive opium wars. They're called so-called opium wars. The two wars were fought in 1810 and 1856 to save their people from the drug addiction which the British were pumping into China. China tried to save itself in 1839 and in 1856. So was the economic devastation, part of the economic devastation that the British inflicted upon us. Let's look at something else. The other factor was the war weavers. This beautiful sarees for which we were famous, for this beautiful weaving work for which we were famous around the world, right? What happened to this? Our weavers got de-skilled. How did our weavers get de-skilled? Our weavers got de-skilled because the entire value chain, the entire economic value chain was monopolized by the British. What does that mean? In the olden days, the power lay with the weaver to negotiate his prices and all that with the middleman. And the middleman, many a times, the middleman would give advances to the weaver. So the risk was shared between the middleman and the weaver in case there was a market failure or some such thing. But now the British ensured that they were the middlemen, and therefore the power shifted from the weaver to the middleman. So the entire economic value chain was monopolized by them. I'm sure Mr. Parag Tope will speak more on this particular aspect. These were our sea routes and these were our land routes. And what were we doing? Remember, we were exporters of finished luxury goods. Remember, the routes in blue are the sea routes and the routes in red are the land routes by which our goods were exported worldwide. So the economic devastation of India ensured that we moved from a luxury goods manufacturer to a supplier of raw material. Cotton went from here to UK, and from UK it came back to India as what in Marathi we call Manzarpat. Manzarpat stands for Manchester cloth. And Manzarpat was the the roughest possible cloth that was there at that point in time. It is a degradation of the word Manchester cloth, which is Manzarpat in Marathi. And when we were young, this is what we saw, right? So from there, moved from a luxury goods supplier to a supplier of raw material. So this was the economic devastation that was caused. Let me now, so so what choice did our people have? Either work landless laborer because your land is gone. Your land has been taken for cultivation. Land made 1/3 the pay. There's pay discrimination. A white man was paid for that. So these are the only two choices that our people have. At that time. Economic, and he started by causing long-term damage to the education system. And that's a very interesting thing that he says in unless we break the very backbone of this nation, which is her spiritual and cultural heritage. I propose that we replace her old and ancient education system, because if Indians think that all that is foreign and English is good, greater than their own, they will lose their self-esteem, their native culture, and they'll become what we want them to be, a truly dominated nation. He said this in 1835. Does it ring true even today? Think about this. So this is Babington Macaulay speaking about this. What are the others? The other thing that happened was in 1830, there was this man called Adams. He surveyed schools in India. And he found that there were 1,50,748 pathshalas in Bengal alone. In Bengal and Bihar, we had so many pathshalas. So what did they do? They shut the pathshalas. All local pathshalas shut. And again, this is very similar to what happened in Ireland during the potato famine. They shut down all their schools and made English education compulsory. Not just English education compulsory, but what they made sure was that people had low self-esteem while speaking in Irish language. So they made sure that did not have social prestige. So something very similar that they did during the Irish potato famine in India during the 1830s. So therefore, we are talking about personal freedom. So personal freedom, education gone. Sorry. Second thing,
So,
printing of all local language books was banned. Right. All local language books were banned. They said that Oriental books are not to be printed. Only European literature will be taught. So where's the place our our heritage in all this? So, our culture policy. So we are talking still about. Always, I would request you all to read the know you who has received an English education ever continues to be sincerely attached to his religion. If our plans of education are followed, there will not be a single idolater amongst the respectable classes in Bengal in 30 years now. He said this. This is a extract from a letter that he wrote to his father in 1836. So we are talking about personal freedom. In personal freedom, large scale conversion at point in time, not just people who spearheaded the conversions in India. He wrote, he wrote to the parliament in this. This country of 200 million has been claimed by the church. The whole land has been shaken by our missionaries. The Hindu trembles for his religion and Muslim trembles for his. This is something that well documented. Not just this, in 1850, a law was passed where police accompanied the missionaries in case the locals created any trouble. In case the locals resisted their attempts at conversions, the police would accompany the missionaries in that thing. So this is how our personal freedom was at stake at that point in time. So I would want you to, I would come to the thing about political freedom. In the triad of freedom, remember the triad of freedom? Started off with political freedom. I would just like you to wonder about what's the difference between India as a nation and India as a country. So how does one define what India as a nation is? So I would look at it something like this. As an our identity as a nation is about our culture, is about our language, is about our values, is about our rituals, is about the symbols the stories that we pass down generation to generation. These stories are what defines a nation. And do you see light yellow on the right, which you talk about Burma, Thailand, Malaysia, Java, Indonesia? Find Indian influences everywhere. Would that be called a nation? And then what's a country? A country would be just defined by geographical boundaries. That would just define a country. So there's a huge difference between a nation and a country. So therefore, if you're talking about politics being free or the country being free. So these are the other that. So what did 1857 achieve or did not achieve? Did we win the war? And did we win the battle and lose the war, or did we lose the war and the battle? Let's look at this. So political freedom, we did not achieve political freedom. Partially economic freedom, did we achieve? Yes, we did achieve partial economic freedom. Did we achieve personal freedom? Yes, total personal freedom was achieved. And at that point in time, immediately after 1857, remember that the British government was so shaken that the East India Company was stopped from working in India, and the entire East India Company was taken over by the Her Majesty's government. in all this, right? So we will look at the Upalabdha. What did we gain from 1857, and the unfinished was political freedom. That is